Today, I'll break down all of the major steps I took to create this artwork. Now, let's start with arguably one of the most important parts of the 3D process that a surprising amounts of 3D artists seem to ignore, and that's your blockout process. Now, things like great modeling, texturing, and lighting are all very important, but the blockout is the process that a lot of people seem to just rush through. After meticulously going through a lot of great artists' artworks, one thing that I found was common among most of them is the blockout process. Now, whether they be 2D artists or 3D artists. Now, this is the original blockout of my artwork looked. As you can see, it doesn't have to look good at all. It's just about having a composition that you feel comfortable with before you commit. I start with completely free assets from places like Sketchfab and just bash them together with no concern for the end quality. Now that the core idea was established, I faced the first major decision: the mountains. You can download free packs that are available online, or you can use a lot of paid softwares like Gaia, World Creator, Houdini, or even paid add-ons in Blender. For the mountains that I created, I use World Creator. There are many tools. I prefer World Creator because of its fast and snappy visualization. Now, the fundamental way all of them work is you create your mountain within the software, you create the texture maps in different masks, and then you export it in Blender. And ultimately, they all provide you with something called splat maps and height and normal maps. These are maps that allow you to make that same mountain now in your chosen piece of software. For us, it's Blender. You can import the height map, you can apply the normal map, and now you can use all of the different splat maps and stack them on top of each other and give each splat map a unique texture to bring your mountain to life. And the best part is, now that you are in Blender, you can use all of the nodes to your disposal to tweak the splat map to your liking and make the textures look as good and bright as possible. Now, I organize my mountains following the composition that I set out in the blockout. Then I begin to sculpt the main foreground. This isn't just about moving the vertices to create something hilly. I'm thinking about the story. I want the characters to stand on the front hill looking out in awe, and I'm doing all of that with human scale in mind, because when we're dealing with scales of kilometers, we have to keep in mind the tiny human scale. Also, just wanted to do a quick mention that if you want exclusive tutorials and just extra free assets and my blend files of all the scenes I create, they are available on my Patreon. Now, I quickly rotate my sun to settle on the sun position. That's gonna decide how our sun reacts with the environment. I want a sort of backlight coming from the left side of the image. A crucial detail for a scene of this scale is cloud shadows. Now, you could simulate real volumetric clouds for that, but that is computationally brutal. Instead, we could use a much cheaper and smarter method, which is creating a large plane above the scene. We feed a procedural noise texture into the alpha channel and use a color ramp to crush the contrast to decide how harsh or soft the shadows are. It's a very customizable and efficient way to add more depth and realism, as the clouds are supposed to be off-screen to begin with that are casting these shadows. Here, I noticed that the snow texture from World Creator feels a bit off. There's some blurry blobs that just throw off the composition for me. So, I go into texture paint mode, select that specific texture, and you can go into your brush settings and choose a brush that you like to add some extra texture onto this blob. And now I can add and erase to my liking until I'm happy with the snow texture of all of the mountains, and after quite a bit of work, I've erased basically everything that I didn't like. It feels sharper and more deliberate. Also, a note from the future me. I forgot to mention one of the most important lighting things that I use. The real world is really hard to simulate, and a single sun lab is very hard to make feel real, even though it's technically very correct. So, I add extra area lights aimed at the mountain peaks. They have one job: to catch the edges and enhance the silhouettes, create more interest and guiding the viewer's eye. Make sure that they are the same color and temperature as your sun so they will blend seamlessly. As you can see, with them the scene comes to life. Without them, the scene feels very dull and just lacks interest. We have to break and bend some 3D rules to create the results that we want. One of the most important parts of large-scale environments is volumes. It's how you communicate your depth and distance. I use a combination of two methods. First, a giant cube with a principled volume shader. This is our base layer of atmospheric haze. Just a basic volume scatter with very low density. It's simple but immediately separates the mountain layers, giving the scene more breathing room, otherwise it just feels very 2D and flat. The second method is slightly more technical. It requires a plane. Now this might feel a little weird, but it works very well. I use a gradient texture with a color ramp plugged into the alpha. I set the gradient to come from the top, so the volume naturally thins out as it goes higher, just like real mountain fog. Now, this creates one real problem for us. A harsh, ugly line where the volume plane intersects with the ground. It shatters the illusion. The fix is a second gradient that controls the first. Using the texture coordinate node set to object, we make the volume's density dependent on its proximity to the ground geometry. Now, the fog automatically dissipates as it touches the terrain. With a color ramp to crunch the values, you have complete customizable dynamic fog system that gives the mountains a vibrant, airy feeling. You can set the color to a little bit of a bluish hue. Now you can scatter it wherever you want. Now while I do all that, I also simulated a new mountain for the far back. I wanted a more pointy, grand looking mountain just looking over the entire scene. I textured it in the same way and just placed instances of it throughout the scene to give an illusion that there's a far back mountain range just stretching till infinity, as the Himalayas are pretty huge. Rivers are another area where you have to use a lot of trickery to make feel real. I was very inspired by images of this specific river flowing through the Himalayan plateau. Braided channels tell a bit of a story and they look very visually interesting. So first, I use a grease pencil to draw the path I want, thinking about how it would naturally split and form the small islands. Now, the interesting part. I add a displace modifier to the landscape itself. I create a new blank image texture for it, and we're gonna name it River Displace. Now we can go into texture painting mode on the landscape itself and can start painting exactly where we want the river to be carved in. We don't even need any special brush with any special texture. By just painting in white, you tell the displace modifier where to push the geometry down. It's a process of slowly just painting and erasing and spending time to get the shapes just right. Now, once you're happy, we can go to our displace modifier and set the mid-level to 0. That means no matter how much we change the strength, it's not going to affect the natural position where we put the landscape in. But it still looks a little low poly, so to fix that we can just subdivide the landscape mesh for more detail, and now we can keep the value subtle, just a few points into the negative, and we get the result that we're looking for. And now because we also used a painted mask, texturing is effortless. We can use the same mask as a factor in a mix shader to blend our ground material with a new water material. And that is just a basic principled PSTF with very low roughness and maybe a little bit of metallicness, and make the hue a bit turquoise because of the natural color that the water in these plateaus gains from the minerals from the rocks. Now to add another layer of detail, we can add a noise texture crunched by a color ramp and plug that into a bump node of the water shader. This gives a bit of the illusion of flow and direction. Now that the main landscape has been modeled, we need to scatter a lot of vegetation. For that, I created some spruce trees that are extremely low poly because the trees are probably going to be like 4 to 5 pixels that are far in the back and scattered in the thousands and thousands. Now, firstly, I want to just scatter the spruce trees by themselves onto the main landscape in the back, the main mountain. And to scatter them, I don't even need to paint. I can just use one of my masks that I exported out of World Creator. And now because of the great 5.0 update that Blender received, now we have much better and improved scatter tools. So I'm using GeoScatter for this process, but you don't have to at all anymore. You can do all the same stuff almost using just the base Blender scatter. you can use the same image masks now. Before you needed vertex groups, and for that you needed to subdivide a lot, but now you can just use an image like you can use in Geoscatter, and you can do all of the other randomized parameters. So you could just use the same splat map that I'm using inside of the standard scatter of Blender. Now, after the background is done, I also want some more lush, just more deciduous style trees in the foreground. For that, I will import some trees. Just 3 are enough, as these trees tend to be quite dense. And then, using a new scatter layer with a new image texture, I'm going to start painting these trees in specific solid chunks. And this is also extremely intentional. You don't just need to fill up the space. We gotta create proper clumps of vegetation that guide the eye. Think of the trees as guiding the viewer looking through the landscape in specific shapes. I don't want to just place them everywhere, then it's just a blob of trees. Grouping them up creates a far more interesting result. Now, of course, we're not done here. This is just the first pass of the vegetation. We're gonna go through the vegetation multiple times during the process and keep refining as the time goes. The monasteries. Now, we need the main focal point of the image, a reason for this place to exist, the Tibetan monasteries. I obviously collected a lot of references, and a lot of them tend to have a similar color and architectural pattern. So with that in mind, I open a new Blender file, and we will use the box tool to create the first box. And to create these buildings, we don't need complex shapes. We start with very basic boxy shapes. And of course, when doing this, don't forget the scale. Keep something human-sized with you. Now, most of this modeling process revolves around the same few steps: extrusions, bevels, edge loops, and scaling things, and extruding things again. So, for example, here I am just adding edge loops, beveling, extruding. And if you want to extrude inwards, instead of just extruding by E, you can press Alt-E, and then you can extrude along normals, or you can just extrude manifold, and they give similar results. Now, most of this is just about intention, how you want the shape to look by using these exact same 4 and 5 methods. An extruding silhouette is all we need, as we're not going to have a close-up of any of this. Now, using the box tool, I'm going to keep stacking more boxes on top of each other, and then using the exact same steps of beveling, extruding, and beveling, and adding more edge loops. And after a good hour of modeling, now we're going to use some textures. Now I import one white plaster texture that we're going to convert into 3 plaster textures by just using a mix shader node set to multiply, and then set the factor to just 1 and choose the other color which you want it to represent. And we're going to create red plaster, white plaster, and gold plaster. And a 4th texture of wood. And that's the entire palette. Now again, with all of those textures onto the same model, we can just select the specific faces we want that specific material to represent. Now, without windows, these obviously look a little flat and boring. The windows add more visual interest. For that, we can just create a cube and set that as a boolean to this building. Now, how do you create multiple of these windows? Well, now since you have one boolean, you can just go into edit mode by pressing tab and just duplicate the same size, the same cube multiple times wherever you want to be a window. So you won't need multiple booleans, just one boolean does it all. And I'm gonna painstakingly just go through the boring process of putting these windows everywhere. Some smaller, some bigger. It's just about trying to stay as efficient and fast as possible. Now, to create the actual window, we're going to put a lot of edge loops in every single place we want the wood to be at. Now we're going to select the glass panels and extrude those inside, giving it more of a 3D feel. Now we can just go in one by one and hand place every single window onto the building. I'm also going to create one specific tower asset of, again, the same palette, the same shapes, the same colors. And it's going to be our main secondary building with detail that's going to be in a lot of different parts. And of course we can create some more interesting shapes, for example creating this wooden bit, using the same thing, and then we can just array it in a lot of different parts, adding more tertiary detail onto the buildings. I also do this one little fun thing which I see in a bunch of these buildings, which is creating some white circles into the red patches. And I just don't stick to that as well, I also add some red circles into the white patches. just adds an extra level of interest. Now we're gonna bring them into our main scene. The first thing I do is position my main asset, the main focal point, the largest part of the monastery, and I'm going to build everything else around it. I also create this really basic rectangular wall asset that is going to be kind of just act as fortification around the monastery itself. I just added a bunch of edge loops so that it has more geometry, so that now we can displace it. And now I'm gonna use this simple deform modifier with an array stacked on top of it to just bend it and create interesting shapes using it. It's that simple, just create modular wall assets. And we're gonna start putting it in a lot of different places. I also have this one other basic cube-like shape of just representing some secondary houses around the monastery, so it looks like there's a lot more people that live nearby. And we can put that in a lot of other places as well. And along with the tower placed everywhere around, we have a good balance of different kinds of shapes. And after spending a good bit of time on scattering them, I'm happy with how it's turning out. Now the buildings are placed, the vegetation is placed, but the scene still feels very incomplete. And now to fix that, I realized that I now needed to put the clouds. I really love this process, and I kind of love just imagining clouds as being clothing for mountains. Without them, they just feel a little naked and small, the scale isn't as apparent. A mountain just shrouded in mist and clouds just feels so much more massive. I'm using Cloud VDBs for this process, and you can find a lot of free and paid assets available for this. I'm using free ones that were provided by, for example, Disney. I'm using these clouds to separate the monastery from the background peaks. This separation is pretty crucial. It tells the viewer's brain that there's just air and a lot of space here, there's a lot of distance. Now, let's do a test render. So the clouds really soften up some of these really hard and harsh shapes, and I'm liking how that looks. The background looks better, but the foreground, I notice it still is quite empty and needs a lot of work. So now we need to put a lot more work here to give the illusion that there's a lot of detail and stuff happening onto the main foreground as well. So the first thing we're gonna start to fix that, I'll take this grass that is very pointy so that I can orient it in one specific direction. Now using another image mask, I'm gonna scatter it in the foreground. But I struggle a lot in making the grass actually look lush and interesting. I put in a strong spotlight and try to light it through that in multiple directions. And finally, I stick with some backlighting. The spotlight is very wide, has a high strength, and is very soft, and it really helps making it feel very translucent and lush. Generally, the way translucency is visible is the opposite of the light source. So if the light is from the front, you're going to see it sparkle from the back. And that is what we're seeing now. It's much brighter and much more interesting to look at. Now I'm gonna pick another grass that is a bit taller and more long, and I'm gonna scatter it the same way with much lower density to create more variety. Now with our front foliage set in, the scene feels so much more interesting and alive. The next thing to add more detail into our scene is going to be some crops. Just some big old wheat fields or whatever crop that they grow in the region. I'm gonna go with the generic wheat as it's just the most recognizable for the viewer. So using the same thing, creating a basic image mask, I start painting specific patches that are very normal and common in just rectangular or very geometric in their shape. And I'm gonna make some clumps and just spread them all across the landscape. And then I'm gonna pick something that resembles a crop and scatter it with pretty high density. Now this takes a little bit, but it's absolutely worth it. I'm gonna create even more wheat fields and just organize this in a more cohesive manner. I also customize a bit of a smaller house using the exact same Tibetan assets that we made before and apply the same windows and a door to it, so that we can communicate that there's somebody who actually lives there to maintain these fields. And I'm gonna enshroud these small little homes inside of some lush plants so they feel more interconnected into the scene. Doing another test render, and we can still see a lot of just a barren ground that still doesn't look good at all. So the way I'm gonna fix that is just more foliage, more intentional foliage to cover up a lot more of the ground. So after another pass on the ground, I'm much more happier with the way it looks. And before another final render, I'm going to do one more final tweak. I'm going to add some more intentional backlighting onto the main monastery, because it doesn't draw as much attention as I would like it to as of yet. So just another strong pointed area light in the back, and maybe another one onto the side. And with that, it shines just perfectly. Now I'm going to do another test render and see how the scene looks. And I feel like it's coming along much better now. Now the next tweak is going to be made to the riverbank. The texture looks very blotchy and just all over the place. We're going to make it more intentional, so I'm going to go into the image texture and start painting it in a much harsher way so that it's visible, it's sharper, and it's more intentional. And I cover a lot more of the sea bank with just sandiness, and I like the look of it much better. Now I'm going to put another house in the foreground, a bit closer. Then I also scattered rocks, thousands of them. Rocks are just noise that break up the smooth surface. They give the ground and trees just a bit more life. Bushes are going to do the exact same effect. So I'm going to import some extra bush assets, and I'm going to create a new layer of bush on every single main landscape and just going to scatter away a lot more bushes. That's just another extra layer of noise that is smaller than the trees but is bigger than the rocks and just fills up that little medium layer that is missing. Another thing is missing window panels on some of the new buildings that we placed in the monastery. I'm not even going to use booleans because of just there's no need, they're so far in the back. I'm just gonna array a lot of windows wherever it's necessary onto our buildings. I also gave some buildings a bit more of a yellowish hue because I noticed in the reference that some of the buildings tend to have that, just adds more variety to the building. And that is the main goal, just variety in a way that people don't notice but just feels realistic. It doesn't need to be tacky and too, but just there, just present. And with another test render, I like the scene so much more now. The next step is going to be both of our main characters. First, I'm going to break down how I'm going to make the yacht. I have a yacht model that I have in one of my asset folders. I generally try to collect as many free assets I find when I'm browsing around on the internet. I feel like it's just a habit that every 3D artist should develop, is some asset you see that you think could be useful, just save it for the future. I probably saved this asset a year ago and it's coming in use now. So, scattering is also more fun in Blender compared to a year ago because of the new tools. So for fur, we can just go to curves by pressing Shift A and add fur. And now it applies all of these modifiers to the stack on the side, and we can play with the values of these modifiers. For example, the interpolate curves. This modifier is what's deciding how many children each curve has, and the density. We can change the distance to guides from 0 to an actual value, so there's a radius around one single strand of hair of just children particles. If it's set to 0, they just kind of go everywhere. We can also add this trim hair curves modifier to manipulate the length. You can add or remove length. I'm also going to add a material, just a principled hair PSDF, with the standard texture for now, just black. And I'm happy with the thickness of the hair, it looks pretty good. And now I'm going to start grooming it. After grooming, we can just add the exact same underlying texture onto the hair, but manipulate it a little bit. Use the curves node and hue saturation to give it just a bit more a nicer balanced hue. Because a cow in the mountains isn't going to be perfectly groomed, it's going to have some color variation, some dirt. From here, it's just stacking more and more fur layers. For example, I'm going to add another one, and here I'm going to braid. And after braiding, they just become clumped, and we can have a bunch of them just scattered around to add just extra complexity. I'm going to do another thing for the top of the head. Now the yak is looking realistic enough for our purpose. Now I'm going to just pose it to make it sit naturally, and I'm going to bring it into the main scene. Now the yak for now looks a little bit too dark for my liking. Thankfully, there's a really easy trick to fix that. If I want more backlighting and I don't want anything else to be affected around the yak, I can just place a big area light, lighting it up, and then we can go to the settings, the properties of the light, and select light linking, and we can just add the yak collection. Now the light only affects the yak. We can increase the strength to however much we would like, and it's only going to affect the yak. And that's perfect for our use case. I also struggle quite a bit with deciding the color of the yak. I kind of think of going a bit more dark, just a black colored yak, but then I think that is just introducing something else into the color palette and it's gonna attract too much attention. If I go with white, there's already a lot of white in the scene, so it's just gonna blend seamlessly with the palette. So I stick with that. And I'm pretty happy with the results so far. Now we need to move on to the monk. For the base, I use the basic human gin. And now I'm gonna use a reference of just the basic clothing that monks tend to have. Red and yellow are the main two colors. So I go into Marvelous Designer and model out some basic clothing onto the monk. It's a really easy and intuitive tool. It feels very fun to just play with cloth without it just crashing on you like it does in Blender. I simulate that and then I just import it back into Blender. I apply a solidify modifier to give it some thickness and then adjust a basic red texture and some yellow. Now a trick to make things translucent is add one translucent BSDF, attach the same color and mix them with 0.75 or 0.8 value. That's gonna make it slightly translucent, but in just enough to make a difference without overpowering the scene. It doesn't feel fake, it's just right enough. Now I go onto Pinterest to figure out reference for a staff he's going to hold. I want it to be simple, nothing too fancy or flashy. So for that, I am going to create a cylinder, squeeze it and make it tall enough. Now I'm gonna create a screw using the screw tools that you can get on a free add-on. And I'm just gonna select the spiral and just take it out, delete the rest, and then turn that spiral into a curve. And stack that onto the main cylinder. And now I'm gonna give it some thickness. Also just put a sphere there, just adding more interest, that's all. Then just create out a basic shape, add a circle to it, add some more of these circular things inside of the main circle that are just going to be jingling about. This seemed very fun just to look at, honestly. Then I found this cloth image that I want to just hang off of it. I'm going to cut it out by pressing K. That allows us to use the knife tool. The threads are simple. I'm just going to create just another fur and just use one strand to simulate the threads along it. And there we have the main thing that's going to hang off of it. We can parent it to the main staff and just attach it there. And there it is, the monk is done. Now just we're going to find more pieces of Tibetan culture that we want to put into the main scene, like this flag. Creating this is simple. Again, just cut it out and then find a stick anywhere, for example polyhaven, and then attach it to that. Create a very simple shader derived from that image, add some roughness, some bump, and a bit of translucency that's very important when we're in the harsh sun, and a simple deform modifier to bend them along the wind. Also placing some rocks nearby it, otherwise it feels a little too empty and just kind of out of place. The rocks ground it. Now to do the cloth that's going to be hanging from a lot of different strands, a big centerpiece of Tibetan culture. For that we can just cut out further deep into the same cloth and cut these multiple colors out, which are the standard Tibetan colors you'll see, and apply cloth modifier to it. You can just select one edge, select that as a vertex group, and then go into your cloth modifier and just use that as a pin group so now it doesn't just fall. Add a wind modifier with a pretty high strength and boom, the cloth is simulating. You can just copy that onto all of the other pieces of cloth and now they're all simulating. Now, after you bake all of them, just find a specific frame that you like of the shapes and just set them to a mesh. I'll bring them in the main scene and array them onto a curve. I use the random array modifier that is found on this video. This was a big help because I couldn't really figure out myself how to actually instance it on a collection. It's easy to array something with an object, but I just couldn't find anything that allows me to array a collection with very specific parameters onto a curve. I'm not sure why that doesn't exist. I tried BagaPi and a few other things, but this video saved my life, so thank you very much. Now I'm going to go through everything and put the Tibetan prayer flags onto them. They add just splashes of primary colors, the red, the blue, the yellow, the green, that contrast beautifully just against the muted tones of the rest of the scene. To bring just a bit more subtle life to the scene, I add these just pollen and leaf-like scattered bits onto the foreground, flying about to create more movement. Just this dynamic, turbulent wind force, it becomes more apparent with more flying things. I'm also going to add some extra variation because the foreground feels just a little too unrealistic with the same amount of grass everywhere, so I add some more variation. And now, in this test render, I try to just notice what's wrong with the scene. Why still does it not feel alive? And I feel like just adding a bit more of a flying cloth from the main monk is gonna add some more interest and just dynamicism to the scene, if that's even a word. So I do that, I simulate it, and I bring that back into Blender. And after adding solidify and the same exact texture to it, it feels just a bit more dynamic. I like the way it looks. I am going to add just a bit more imperfection and grime to the main clothing, just darken it up in some areas and lighten it up in others. Now, in the final minutes, the composition's there, but the feeling is just slightly not right. The sky, I feel it's too white, it feels too low altitude, right? If you look at these images that I took, and the sky is just such a deep shade of blue. At 4,000 meters, the sky is not that light. So, just finding an image and placing it there makes the slight difference that I wanted to. I'm gonna also make another change, which is making the focal length just slightly less, from 23 to 21, and adjust some of the foliage that is not scattered properly to match that. Add just one more cloud because now a certain part of the mountains is visible, which was not before. And after quite a lot of work, a good few days, here's the final render. It took almost 2 weeks of work condensed into just these 30 minutes. But I hope you can see the difference that it makes from start to end to add all these little details. Not just some magic trick that you can perform in a little bit, it's a lot of things added on top of one another to get the final result that we did.